Jack Thompson has blamed video games for a whole lot of school shootings to which they cannot conclusively be linked. But one of the worst school shootings in U.S. history that he tried to link to the video game Counterstrike was the shooting at Virginia Tech in 2007. I know I've already covered Jack Thompson a little bit, but I think this really shows the levels to which Jack Thompson was willing to sink back when he was a lawyer, to try to connect video games somehow to every bad thing he could think of that happened. So without any further ado, here we go.
Attorney and school shooting expert Jack Thompson is now with me. Jack, good morning to you. We spoke on Monday afternoon by telephone when we were still learning about these details. Take me through this. He wore sunglasses all the time, even indoors, played a song repeatedly in his iPod called Collective Soul. Sorry, the song is called Shine by the group Collective Soul. He exuded loneliness, never made eye contact, spoke in a whisper. Put this together for a profile.
Now, I don't think it's news to anybody that the Virginia Tech shooter was a pretty screwed up guy. It's pretty much a safe assumption that anyone who does a massive shooting like that has got some issues. But notice that video games were never brought up there, which makes Jack Thompson's response a bit of a non sequitur.
Well, let me mention one thing that we talked about at 3:10 on Monday before we even knew who the shooter was, Bill. If you recall, I told you and your audience that the likelihood was strong that the shooter here at Virginia Tech was an obsessive video gamer who probably trained himself on a shooter game, as is Klebold and Harris did, as Michael Carneal in Paducah, Jeffrey Weiss in Red Lake. I could go on for 40 minutes citing these schools so that are like the battlefields of the Civil War. We know them by their name.
Now, there's a lot that I really have to object to in this one. First of all, comparing this to the battles of the Civil War, where sometimes tens of thousands of people died in the U.S. Civil War, has nothing to do with it being related to video games. It's just a means of propaganda to try to tie this to a much more horrible event. Not that Virginia Tech wasn't horrible, but 32 people, or 30-something people, versus tens of thousands, he's kind of trying to make it into something even bigger than it was to try to make his anti-video game point. So he's essentially using the massacre as a means to an end, which is incredibly selfish and inappropriate, obviously. Now, second of all, I've often heard it said that we use etc. when we have completely run out of things to say. And that's basically what he did here. Even though it's obvious hyperbole to say that he could go on for 45 minutes with these examples of school shootings, it's essentially saying etc. because he has nothing more to say. He has no more evidence. So he's just like, oh, no, trust me, I've got way more examples, when really he's run out. And finally, and probably the most important thing, is he claims that he basically could have known ahead of time that this guy played a lot of video games. Because, you know, he gave all these examples of other shooters who were addicted to video games. So do you all remember all those weird things with this guy's psychological profile, the shooter's profile, being completely introverted, obsessively listening to songs, wearing glasses all the time? Are those things also due to video games? I doubt it. I play plenty of video games. I don't do any of these things. Clearly, this guy had other issues going on that were unrelated to video games. And he probably played video games a lot. That's probably true. But it fits with his introverted and antisocial personality.
In that interview, Bill, I mentioned the game Counterstrike. The reason I did that is the worst school shooting in history prior to Monday was at the hands of Robert Steinhauser, Erfurt, Germany, killed 16, trained on the game Counterstrike, an online Microsoft shooter game, incredibly violent. Law enforcement in Germany determined the connection, and frankly it changed the election for chancellor in Germany in a debate over these games. We now learn in the Washington Post this morning that Cho was an obsessive player of the game Counterstrike.
Jack, let me stop you there. Yeah. I was made aware of that, and I went back to that article and found no reference to it.
So I decided to do some research into both whether Counter-Strike is an especially violent game that one could train on, potentially, and as to whether this Washington Post article ever existed. And if it did, what did it say about Counter-Strike in relation to the shooter? What I found was that Counter-Strike appears to be an exceptionally bad game to train on if you wanted to somehow train in a video game, which I don't think you really can. Because according to my research, Wikipedia, a common hack in this game lets you see through walls. Other ones make it so flashbang grenades don't do anything, and you don't ever have to reload. That seems as though it would be problematic if you were trying to train on the game. Now, I'm going to edit out the rest of this interview that talks about the Washington Post article, because I was unable to find the article. It appears as though, according to bloggers, it did exist at one point. But when they actually got into the gunman's apartment, they found no evidence that he had ever played the game. So, where the Washington Post got that idea is unknown, but it was quite possibly because Jack Thompson said so beforehand, before this interview. And he was just guessing at that point.
A few of the things I just want to go through here quickly.
Yeah, sure.
His mannerisms and his characteristics. I mean, this guy fit a profile. And the teachers were alerted to him 2 years ago. And they sought counseling for him, and he simply refused. What happened in this case ultimately is that the police said, we can't do anything because he has not threatened anyone. Does that fly for you?
Well, credit where credit is due. It's great to see Jack Thompson's argument just get completely destroyed by this Fox News anchor in probably, what was that, about 15 or 20 seconds? You know, I gotta give the guy a lot of credit. He called out Jack Thompson on his points when they didn't make any sense. And that's why, normally in the past, I've tried to say that Fox News as a whole has problems. With the notable exception of Glenn Beck, I haven't called out the anchors themselves too much. And this is an example of an anchor who's doing a good job. This is an example of a one-on-one debate, the anchor versus Jack Thompson. And it's extremely interesting that Jack Thompson, despite being a lawyer, you know, his argument can't really hold its own in this case. Clearly, the shooter was just incredibly out of his mind, and video games had nothing to do with it.
Is that fly for you?
Well, listen, no, because in Paducah, where I represented the parents in that school shooting, and that was December 1 of 1997, there were kids in the school who knew something was going to happen that day. They didn't say anything. Teachers knew there was a problem. They didn't do anything. People have asked me, when are we going to finally get it? And I have said since Paducah, quote, we're going to finally get it. We're going to start intercepting these events when there is an event so cataclysmic that everybody gets it.
So the Paducah shooting was in 1997, and Jack Thompson's been saying since then that we'll get it as soon as there's a really serious school shooting. So Columbine doesn't count? Because according to Jack Thompson, getting it is when we start banning all violent video games. And that hasn't happened yet. So apparently, no, you're wrong. Even your own prediction is wrong in the context of you making that prediction. You already knew it was wrong when you said it in this interview. Now, aside from that, everything Jack Thompson just said is a complete non sequitur. Look, none of that had anything to do with video games. He knew his argument was falling apart, so he simply stopped the argument and started talking about a completely unrelated school shooting that happened 10 years earlier.
And here it is. This is the 9/11 of school shootings.
Jack Thompson,
and the video.
Thank you for your time today. I apologize we're short on time. We're trying to squeeze in some other news before these press conferences begin. Thank you, Jack. Live in Miami.
Thank you.
All right.
The point of me making this video was to show just how low Jack Thompson was willing to go. Even though this interview is a solid 5 years old, and I know that, this is probably the best example of how low Jack Thompson will sink. He compares the shooting to 9/11. Okay, he's clearly just trying to create an emotional response in order to further his own goals. He doesn't even care that at this point they had found no proof, in fact they never found any evidence at all, let alone proof, that this person had played Counterstrike in college. So he was just trying to further his own goals by using this tragedy and the emotions associated with it to try to get people to act without thinking. And aside from that, when his arguments start to fall apart, he simply resorts to a non sequitur. Or, if the debate turns in the direction away from violent video games, he again uses a non sequitur if need be to get it back on the topic of video games. He clearly has a biased agenda, and that's why he was soon disbarred in Florida as an attorney, which is the state where he was licensed to practice. I do want to address the quality of this video. Due to the fact that this video is such an old one, I couldn't find it in very high quality. I'm going to try to make it 480p, but unfortunately it's starting to look like it's going to end up being 360p. Anyway, I hope you all enjoyed it, and I hope this has informed you a bit more about the character Jack Thompson.